You know, history has this funny way of smoothing over all the rough edges. We remember the headline, but we totally forget the fine print.
Oh, absolutely.
And honestly, there is no bigger headline and no messier fine print in the entire history of exploration than Ferdinand Magellan.
It's the ultimate historical branding exercise, isn't it? The name is just synonymous with the globe itself. You say Magellan, and the first thing anyone thinks is
First man to circumnavigate the globe.
first circumnavigation every time.
Right. It's the answer to the trivia question. It's in every single textbook. But here's the thing, and this is the part that just gets me every time. When you actually sit down with the primary sources, especially the diaries of Antonio Pigafetta, who was the chronicler on the ship, you realize that headline is, well, it's technically a lie.
It's not just a lie. It's a complete fabrication of the timeline. Ferdinand Magellan never finished the trip.
Never made it back.
He never made it back to Spain. He died in the surf in the Philippines about halfway through the voyage.
And the man who actually did complete the first circumnavigation, the guy who captained that last ship back to Seville.
A man named Juan Sebastián Elcano.
And here's the kicker, the part that gets left out of the grade school version. Elcano absolutely despised Magellan.
Despised might be putting it lightly. I mean, Elcano spent the first half of the voyage actively trying to undermine Magellan. He was part of a mutiny against him.
It's just a profound historical irony. The man who gets all the credit died this horrible, violent death thousands of miles from home.
And the man who actually brought the ship home was one of his bitterest rivals.
So today we're going to do something a little different. We're not just going to recount the map making. We want to reconstruct the actual reality of this voyage based on the sources. And let me tell you, it is nothing like the romanticized version of brave men sailing into the sunset.
No, this is a story of treason, execution, scurvy, religious obsession, and a fatal, fatal error in judgment.
And we are so lucky to have incredible documentation for this. We're leaning really heavily on the journals of Antonio Pigafetta, who was this Italian scholar who basically paid his way onto the ship just to see the world.
Pigafetta is a fascinating character in his own right. He wasn't a sailor. He was almost like a tourist with a notebook. And without him, we'd know almost nothing of the day-to-day horror of this expedition.
He's the reason we know about the politics, the meals.
The specific words spoken in the final moments, he saw it all.
So let's unpack this. Before we even get to the ships and the starvation and everything else, we have to understand the man who was Ferdinand Magellan. Because looking at his background, he seems like the most unlikely candidate to lead a Spanish expedition.
Well, primarily because he wasn't Spanish.
Right.
He was Portuguese, born around 1480, probably in northern Portugal, to minor nobility, and this is crucial. He wasn't an explorer by trade, not at first. He was a soldier of the empire. He spent something like 8 years in the Indian Ocean fighting for the Portuguese crown.
Right. The sources mentioned he was at the Battle of Diu. He was in Malacca. This wasn't some armchair admiral studying star charts in a library.
No, not at all. He was a warrior. He knew the smell of gunpowder and the sound of steel. In fact, in 1513, he was fighting in Morocco at a place called Azamor. During a skirmish there, he was wounded in the leg.
And that wound never healed right, did it?
It never healed properly. It left him with a permanent limp for the rest of his life.
That limp is such a defining image for me. You just have this picture of a hardened veteran limping through the court of Lisbon, probably feeling like he's given everything to his country.
And feeling like his country gave him absolutely nothing back. That is the catalyst for everything that follows. Despite years of bleeding for Portugal, he fell completely out of favor with King Manuel I.
Why? What happened?
Magellan had been accused of illegal trading with the Moors, basically war profiteering. Now, the charges were eventually dropped, but the stigma, it stuck.
It's the classic disgruntled employee scenario, but on a massive geopolitical scale.
Exactly. Magellan felt he was owed a higher pension, more respect. He went to King Manuel repeatedly with this plan. He wanted to sail to the Spice Islands, the Moluccas. But he had this radical idea. He wanted to go west.
Or cross the Atlantic to avoid the Portuguese route around Africa that they already controlled.
Exactly. And King Manuel just shut him down.
Completely, repeatedly. The accounts of their final meeting are just brutal. Magellan asks for permission to go. The king says no. Magellan asks for a tiny increase in his pension. The king says no.
So finally, Magellan asks if he has the king's permission to offer his services to another country.
Which is really just a polite way of asking, can I go work for your worst enemy?
And King Manuel, in this moment of pure arrogance that would literally change the course of history, basically looked at his mails and said, I don't care what you do.
That has to be one of the biggest oops moments in royal history.
It was a massive strategic error, and Magellan took him at his word. In 1517, he packs up, moves to Seville, Spain. He changes his allegiance. He marries the daughter of a prominent local, and effectively he defects to Portugal's biggest rival.
So now he's got to sell this same idea to the Spanish king, Charles I, who's, what, a teenager at this point?
Just a teenager.
But I want to pause on the pitch Magellan makes, because there was a huge legal hurdle here, wasn't there?
Yeah.
The Treaty of Tordesillas.
Right. To understand why this whole voyage was so controversial, you have to look at that treaty. The Pope had essentially taken a ruler and drawn a line right down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean.
And just divided the non-Christian world in half.
In half. Portugal got everything east of the line, so Africa and the route to India. Spain got everything to the west. The Americas, basically.
The arrogance is just breathtaking when you really think about it.
It was. But it created this huge problem for Spain. They wanted the spices, all the wealth from the east, but they couldn't sail east to get them.
So Magellan's pitch was a workaround. He's essentially saying, I can get you to the Spice Islands by going west, through your side of the map.
Exactly. He was hacking the treaty. He argued that the Spice Islands were so far east, they actually wrapped all the way around the globe and fell back into the Spanish hemisphere.
Did he actually believe that? Or was he just, fudging the geography to get the funding?
It's debated, but he certainly sold it with conviction. And he had a secret weapon in his pitch letters from a friend, Francisco Serrón, who is already living in the Spice Islands, describing their insane wealth. And he had a slave named Enrique.
Enrique is such a key figure in all of this.
He is vital. Enrique was from that region, Malacca, or maybe Sumatra. Magellan brought him to the Spanish court and presented him as living proof of the people they would find. He used Enrique and those letters to convince the young King Charles that the prize was reachable.
And the king bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. He made Magellan an admiral, gave him the command of the Order of Santiago, and funded the Armada of Molucca.
Which brings us to the fleet itself. 5 ships. The Trinidad, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Santiago, and the famous Victoria.
And a crew that was, well, let's call it diverse, but not in a happy, harmonious kind of way.
It was a powder keg. You had about 270 men, but the nationalities were all over the map. You had Spaniards, of course, but also Portuguese, Italians, Greeks, French, Germans.
Even one Englishman and, of course, Enrique.
But the real friction was at the top. You have a Portuguese commander leading a Spanish fleet.
That was the fatal flaw in the hierarchy from the very beginning. The captains of the other ships were all Spanish nobleman guys like Cartagena and Quesada, and they absolutely resented being bossed around by Magellan.
To them, he was a traitor to his own country, a foreigner, and possibly a Portuguese spy sent to sabotage the whole thing.
And back in Portugal, King Manuel is suddenly realizing he made a catastrophic mistake. The sources say he tried to sabotage the fleet before they even left.
Oh, he was furious. He launched a whole campaign of harassment. He ordered Magellan's family crest to be vandalized back in Portugal. There were credible rumors of assassination plots in the streets of Seville.
Wow.
The Portuguese ambassador tried to bribe Magellan to cancel the trip, and when that didn't work, he started whispering in the ears of the Spanish captains, sowing the seeds of mutiny before they even untied the ropes.
Talk about a toxic work environment. I mean, they haven't even left port, and half the management team already wants the CEO dead.
Exactly. The fleet sailed in September 1519 under this dark cloud of suspicion and hatred, and Magellan knew his own captains were just looking for any excuse to remove him.
So they cross the Atlantic. The first major stop is Rio de Janeiro in Brazil.
Yeah, specifically Guanabara Bay. Now, because this was Portuguese territory, they had to be careful, but they managed to stop and trade with the Tupi natives.
This part of the journal always feels like the calm before the storm. They're trading little bells and mirrors for fresh food and water.
It was a brief respite, but the discipline issues started showing their teeth almost immediately. The sources note a really grim detail here. Magellan executed a crew member, a man named Antonio Salomon, for sodomy while they were in Brazil.
So he's sending a pretty clear message right from the start.
He was asserting absolute authority. He was telling the entire crew, I am the law out here. But the real trouble begins when they leave the warmth of Brazil and head south, searching for this mythical passage to the Pacific.
And they don't find it. Not at first.
No. The coast of South America just goes on and on and on. They keep sailing south, and it gets colder, the days get shorter, the seas get rougher. They explore the river plate where modern-day Argentina is, thinking that might be the strait, but it's just a dead end.
So now it's winter in the southern hemisphere. They're stuck in Patagonia at this bleak, desolate harbor they called Port St. Julian.
It's the bottom of the world. It is freezing. The men are on reduced rations. They're miserable, and that misery is the perfect breeding ground for mutiny.
This is the Easter Mutiny of 1520. And honestly, the way it plays out is like something out of Game of Thrones.
It really is. On Easter night, 3 of the 5 captains, Cartagena, Quesada, and Mendoza, they make their move. They secretly board the San Antonio, put its captain in chains, and stab the ship's master. By morning, they control 3 of the 5 ships.
So Magellan wakes up, looks out at the harbor, and realizes he's completely outnumbered. The rebels send him a message basically saying, we're in charge now and we're going back to Spain.
Most commanders would have surrendered. It was hopeless. But Magellan, he does something incredibly ruthless. He knew that open warfare would just sink the ships, so he used deception. He sent a small boat over to Mendoza's ship, the Victoria, supposedly to deliver a letter to negotiate terms.
The classic Trojan horse.
Exactly. Mendoza, feeling confident, lets the men on board. He takes the letter from the messenger, looks at it, and apparently starts laughing at Magellan's audacity. At that exact moment, the messenger pulls out a dagger and stabs Mendoza in the throat.
Wow, just like that.
Simultaneously, another boat filled with loyalists storms the ship. In a matter of minutes, Magellan had regained control of the Victoria. Now the balance of power was 3 ships to 2 in his favor. The mutiny just collapsed.
And the punishment. I mean, we talk about harsh management, but this was something else. This was medieval.
In Magellan's eyes, it was necessary theater. He had to make an example of them. Quesada, one of the ringleaders, was beheaded.
Okay, that seems standard for mutiny.
But Magellan didn't stop there. Oh, no. He had Quesada's body quartered,
Oh my God.
cut into 4 pieces, and hung on gibbets on the shore for everyone to see.
And Cartagena, the really high-ranking nobleman.
Cartagena was too well connected to just execute. So Magellan devised a punishment that was arguably much worse. When the fleet finally left St. Julian months later, they left Cartagena behind.
Marooned him.
Marooned him on that desolate, freezing coast with a priest who had also conspired with him. They just left them there with a small supply of hardtack and wine.
Just left to freeze or starve at the edge of the world. They were never seen again.
It established Magellan's absolute terrifying authority. The crew was petrified of him now. But it also hardened the hatred that the remaining Spanish officers felt. They weren't following him out of loyalty anymore.
They were following him out of fear.
Pure fear.
So with the mutiny crushed and the winter finally over, they keep pushing south. And in October of 1520, they find it. The Strait.
The Strait of Magellan,
Yeah.
you know, we look at it on a map today and it's just a line, but in reality, it is this treacherous, winding maze of fjords and waterways. The currents are violent, the winds are completely unpredictable.
It must have been terrifying. They had no idea if it even went all the way through to the other side.
And during this exploration of the strait, they lose another ship. The San Antonio, which was the largest supply ship carrying the bulk of their food.
Oh, no.
It was sent to scout a particular branch of the strait. The pilot, a man named Esteban Gomes, who hated Magellan, saw his chance. He overpowered the captain, turned the ship around.
They deserted.
They fled, turned tail, and sailed all the way back to Spain.
That is a catastrophic blow. They've just lost a massive chunk of their supplies right before what's going to be the longest leg of the journey.
It was devastating. But Magellan didn't know they had deserted. He assumed they were lost or shipwrecked. He actually spent days searching for them before finally giving up and pushing on. And in November 1520, the 3 remaining ships, the Trinidad, Concepcion, and Victoria, emerged from the strait into this vast open ocean.
And the ocean was so calm, so peaceful compared to the violent Atlantic, that Magellan named it Mar Pacifico, the Pacific Ocean.
A beautiful name for what became essentially a death trap. You have to understand, Magellan had no concept of how large this ocean was. The maps of the time were just completely wrong. They wildly underestimated the circumference of the Earth.
So he had thought the Spice Islands were just a few days away.
A few days, maybe a week, tops. He thought, we'll be there by the weekend. He honestly believed the hard part was over.
And how long did it actually take to cross?
3 months and 20 days.
Pause and imagine that. You think you have rations for a week, and you are out there for nearly 4 months without seeing a single speck of land.
The conditions that Pigafetta describes are the stuff of nightmares. They ran out of fresh food almost immediately. The water in the casks went putrid and turned yellow. Pigafetta writes that they were reduced to eating biscuit dust that was mixed with worms.
And it gets worse than that.
Oh, it gets much worse. They ran out of the wormy biscuits, so they started looking at the ship itself for food. They began cutting the oxhide leather from the yardarms leather that had been hardened by years of sun and rain and salt.
Beating leather.
They would drag it in the sea for 4 or 5 days just to soften it. Then they would grill it over embers and try to chew it.
Eating leather. Eating sawdust from the planks.
Rats became a delicacy, a luxury item. If you were lucky enough to catch a rat, you could sell it to another starving sailor for half a gold ducat.
And then came the scurvy.
Scurvy is just a gruesome, gruesome way to die. It's your body literally falling apart because it can't make collagen. Pigafetta describes the men's gums swelling up until they completely covered their teeth. They couldn't eat even if they had food.
And their old wounds would open up?
Yes. Old scars from years ago would just spontaneously open up and start bleeding again. It's horrific.
About 30 men died during this crossing. But here is the detail that always sticks with me from the sources. Magellan himself never got sick.
It's a fascinating anomaly. While his men are rotting alive around him, Magellan remained perfectly healthy.
Was it just a strong constitution? Or luck?
We think it was his diet. The sources mention that Magellan had a personal stash of preserved quince. It's a fruit, sort of like a pear or an apple, that he kept in his cabin. He ate it as a delicacy, a little taste of home.
He had no idea.
He had no idea, but quince is packed with vitamin C.
It was accidentally medicinal. He was saving his own life without even knowing it.
Right. But think about the optics of that. You're a starving crewman, you're chewing on leather, watching your friends die in the dark, and you look up at the quarterdeck and you see your captain looking healthy, energetic, eating his special private stash of fruit.
It must have looked like sorcery. Or worse, just plain selfishness. It would have fueled that whole us versus them narrative that Elcano and the other Spanish officers were nurturing.
Absolutely. But finally, in March of 1521, they spot land, Guam.
And the first contact to Guam sets a really, really dark precedent for the rest of the voyage.
It was a disaster of cultural misunderstanding. The local Chamorro people came out to the ships. They were amazed by this European technology. They climbed aboard and they started taking things, some rigging, bits of iron, and they took a small skiff, a little rowboat.
To the Chamorro, this was probably just trade shed, right? We give you fresh water and fruit. We're taking this cool boat.
Exactly. In their culture, property was likely more communal or transactional. But to the Europeans, who were starving and paranoid and on edge, this was theft, pure and simple. And Magellan reacted with completely disproportionate violence.
He led a raiding party ashore.
With crossbows and muskets. They burned down 40 or 50 houses and killed 7 men.
Just to get the rowboat back.
Just to get the little boat back. He named the islands La Alameda de los Ladrones, the Islands of Thieves. It just showed that Magellan's patience was completely gone. He was desperate, and he was willing to use terror to get what he needed.
So they leave Guam, restocked but with blood on their hands, and they finally reach the Philippines. This is the moment Magellan had been dreaming of. He has crossed the impossible ocean.
They arrived at the island of Samar and then moved to a smaller island called Limasawa. And this is where we have one of the most incredible, goosebump-inducing moments in the entire history of exploration.
This is the Enrique moment.
Yes. Remember Enrique, the slave Magellan bought in Malacca all those years ago? He had traveled west with Magellan to Portugal, then to Spain, then all the way across the Atlantic, then all the way across the Pacific. He had gone the long way around. So when the fleet arrives in the Philippines, a small boat of locals approaches. Magellan tries to speak to them. Nothing. The Spanish soldiers try nothing. Then Enrique speaks, and they understood him.
That gives me chills every single time I think about it.
He was speaking a Malay dialect that was the trade language of the entire region. The locals replied. They could communicate.
You have to stop and think about the implications of that. Enrique had technically completed the circle. Linguistically, culturally, he was home.
It proved the world was round in a way that no map ever could. They had reached the east by sailing west, and it's very likely that Enrique was the first person in history to culturally circumnavigate the globe.
So with Enrique translating, Magellan starts making alliances. They move to the bigger island of Cebu. And things go surprisingly well at first. Almost. Too well.
It was suspiciously easy. The ruler of Cebu, a man named Raja Humabon, was a very savvy politician. He saw these Europeans with their steel armor and their loud boomsticks, and he saw an opportunity to use them against his own local rivals.
And Magellan saw an opportunity too. But his focus had shifted somehow. He wasn't acting like a merchant or an admiral anymore. He was acting more like a messiah.
He became obsessed with evangelism, absolutely obsessed. He wanted to convert everyone he met to Christianity. Humabon, likely for purely political reasons, agreed to convert. He was baptized as Carlos. His wife was baptized as Juana.
And this is where the Santo Niño comes into the story.
Yes, in a moment of what seems like genuine exchange, Magellan gave the queen a small wooden statue of the child Jesus, and she accepted it with tears in her eyes. That statue is still there, by the way. You can go to the Basilica in Cebu today and see it. It is the oldest Catholic relic in the entire Philippines.
But this religious success, it went to Magellan's head. He started to believe he was invincible. He believed God was personally guiding his sword.
It was hubris, pure and simple. He began ordering all the other local chiefs to convert and pay tribute, not just to Humabon, but to the King of Spain. He was completely upsetting the local balance of power.
And that brings us to Mactan, a small island right across the channel from Cebu.
The chief of Mactan was a man named Lapu-Lapu, and Lapu-Lapu was not having any of it. He refused to bow to Humabon, who he saw as a rival, and he certainly refused to bow to some foreign king he had never even met.
And Magellan takes this as a personal insult.
He took it as a direct challenge to his faith and his authority. His own officers, even the Spanish captains who hated him, begged him not to go. They said, look, we are explorers, not soldiers. Let the locals handle their own politics. We need to get the spices and go home.
But Magellan insisted. He wanted to make a point. He wanted to show off his military superiority to impress his new ally, Humabon.
So he made a series of tactical blunders that are just almost hard to believe. First, he decided to attack Mactan at dawn. He took only 49 men. 49 men. And he was facing a force that Pigafetta estimates was around 1,500 warriors.
49 against 1,500. The math is suicidal.
But Magellan believed one European soldier with armor and a gun was worth 100 locals. He was catastrophically wrong.
And the terrain itself worked against him, too.
Disastrously. He attacked at low tide. The bay at Mactan is filled with coral rocks and shallow water for a long way out. The Spanish ships couldn't get close to the shore.
Which means their cannons.
Their biggest advantage, the ship's cannons, were completely out of range. Useless.
So the men had to get out of the boats and wade to shore.
They had to wade through thigh-deep water for the length of 2 football fields just to reach the beach. By the time they got there, they were slow, they were wet, and they were exhausted. And Lapu-Lapu's men were waiting. And they were smart. They had observed the Europeans. They realized the heads and torsos were armored, but the legs were mostly bare.
So they aimed low.
They aimed for the legs. Pigafetta was there, fighting right next to Magellan. His account is just visceral. He describes the warriors swarming them. They weren't intimidated by the muskets, which were slow to reload and inaccurate at that range. They just rushed in.
And Magellan gets isolated from his men.
He was the target. They recognized the captain. He was shot in the leg with a poison arrow. He tried to pull it out, but then he was hit in the face with a bamboo spear, actually a fire-hardened rattan lance.
It sounds so chaotic and brutal.
It was a brawl in the water. Magellan killed the attacker with his lance, but the lance got stuck in the body. He tried to draw his sword, but he couldn't because his sword arm had already been wounded by another spear. He was defenseless.
And that's the end.
Pigafetta writes, and I'm paraphrasing here, that a warrior struck him on the leg with a large cutlass, and that caused the captain to fall face down. And then they just rushed him with spears and swords until they killed our mirror, our light, our comfort, and our true guide.
Our mirror, our light. You can just hear the heartbreak in Pigafetta's writing. He really loved Magellan.
He did. But the locals didn't. They hacked him to pieces right there in the surf.
And they never got the body back.
No. Humabon offered a huge ransom, copper, iron, anything they wanted. Lapu-Lapu refused. He said he would keep the body as a trophy of his victory. To this day, there is no grave for Ferdinand Magellan. He's just part of the island of Mactan.
So Magellan is dead. The invincible Europeans have been defeated by a local chief. The spell is completely broken. And this is where the story shifts gears into like a survival horror movie.
Yes. Because now, Raja Humabon, the so-called Christian convert, he looks at these surviving Europeans and realizes they are not gods. They are just men, and they are losing. He decides he needs to switch sides before he gets dragged down with them.
The betrayal.
Humabon invited the remaining officers to a banquet ashore, supposedly to give them jewels to take back to the King of Spain. It was a trap. While they were eating, Humabon's men attacked. It was a complete massacre.
And the men on the ships could hear the screaming.
They heard the screaming and they saw the commotion, but they were too terrified to go ashore and help. They just cut the anchor cables and fled. They actually fired their cannons into the village as they left, killing locals and possibly even their own men who were still being held captive. It was just sheer panic.
So now they're leaderless. They're down to about 115 men. They don't even have enough crew to sail all 3 ships.
No. So they make a hard choice. They take the Concepcion, which was the oldest and leakiest ship, and they set it on fire. They transfer the supplies and the men to the Trinidad and the Victoria.
And now, finally, the man who will actually finish the voyage steps up. Juan Sebastián Elcano.
Elcano takes command of the Victoria, and this is important. Elcano was one of the mutineers back at St. Julian. He was a Basque navigator, tough as nails, but he had no love for Magellan's ghost. His only goal now was survival.
They eventually find the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, in November of 1521. They load up with cloves, but now they have a problem. The Trinidad is leaking.
Badly. It was clear it couldn't make the long journey home, so they made this fateful decision to split up. The Trinidad would stay behind for repairs and try to go back the way they came, across the Pacific to Panama, the Spanish route.
And the Victoria, under Elcano, would try to make it home by sailing west.
Which means sailing all the way around Africa, through Portuguese waters.
This is the part of the story that often gets skipped, but it was arguably the most dangerous leg of the entire voyage.
It was. Elcano is sailing a single, rotting ship straight through enemy territory. He's carrying a cargo of spices that is worth an absolute fortune, but if the Portuguese catch him, he and his entire crew will be hanged as pirates.
So it was a stealth mission?
It's a ghost run. They had to avoid all the major ports. They couldn't stop at the Cape of Good Hope. They couldn't stop in Brazil. They had to sail non-stop from Timor all the way to Cape Verde.
And the ship itself is just falling apart.
The pumps were running 24 hours a day just to keep the Victoria from sinking. And, of course, the food ran out again. Pigafetta describes men begging Elcano to just pull into a Portuguese port and surrender because they would rather be in a dungeon than die of starvation at sea.
But Elcano refused.
He was stubborn. He pushed them onward. They ate nothing but rice and water for months. 21 men died on that final leg alone. They were throwing bodies overboard almost every single day.
But finally, in September of 1522, a ship appears in the river at Seville.
The Victoria, it looked like a wreck. The sails were in tatters, the hull was battered, and the men...
How many actually made it back?
Out of the original 270 men who left 3 years earlier, only 18 Europeans walked off that ship. 18. They were so weak they could barely walk. They marched straight from the ship to a shrine to give thanks, holding candles, looking like skeletons.
And Elcano is the hero. He gets the coat of arms from the king. He gets a globe with the Latin inscription, Primus circumdedistis me. You first circumnavigated me.
Yes. Elcano got all the glory, and he immediately used his new platform to absolutely trash Magellan's reputation. He told the king that Magellan was a tyrant, that the mutinies were all Magellan's fault, that the navigational errors were Magellan's fault. For a while, history was written by the survivor.
But Magellan had a defender from beyond the grave.
Pigafetta. He was one of those 18 survivors, but he wasn't a captain, so he wasn't invited to the official debriefings. But he had his book. He traveled all around Europe, presenting his detailed journals to kings and queens, and eventually he published his account.
And because Pigafetta was such a good writer, not just a sailor, his version is the one that ultimately stuck.
His version was filled with the human drama, the tragedy, and crucially, his deep admiration for Magellan. He portrayed Magellan as this flawed but brilliant hero, and Elcano as a competent but ultimately uninspired subordinate. And over the centuries, Pigafetta's narrative won. That's why we know it as Magellan's Voyage and not Elcano's Voyage.
It really is a lesson in the power of keeping a diary.
Absolutely. The pen is mightier than the sword, especially when the guy with the sword dies halfway through the story.
So, looking back at this whole deep dive, what is the real legacy here? Because on the surface, it seems like a complete disaster. They lost 4 of the 5 ships, 250 men, and their commander.
Tactically, it was an unmitigated disaster, but scientifically, it changed everything. For one, they proved the Earth was round empirically, not just as a theory, but much more importantly, they revealed the true scale of our planet.
The sheer size of the Pacific.
That was the shock. No one in Europe understood that the Pacific Ocean covered 1/3 of the planet's surface. Magellan's voyage completely recalibrated the European mind. It showed them that the world was vastly larger and vastly more water than they had ever dared to imagine.
It connected the globe in a continuous loop for the very first time.
It did. It was the beginning of globalization, for better and for worse.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought. something that always nags at me about this whole story. We talked about Enrique, the slave.
Yes, the man from Malacca.
So the history books give the title of first circumnavigator to Elcano. But if Enrique was indeed from the Malay archipelago, and he traveled west to Europe with Magellan years before, and then he traveled west again with the Armada all the way back to the Malay archipelago.
Then he beat Elcano by about a year and a half.
Exactly. When he stepped off that ship in Cebu and could speak to the locals, he had, for all practical purposes, circled the globe.
It is a fascinating argument. We don't know what happened to him after the massacre at Cebu. He just disappears from the written record. But there's a very, very strong case to be made that the first person to circumnavigate the world wasn't a Portuguese captain or a Spanish navigator, but a Malay slave who just wanted to go home.
Which would be the ultimate twist in a story that is already full of them.
It would. It just reminds us that history is so often just a matter of who is holding the pen.
And that's it for this deep dive into the chaotic, brutal reality of Magellan's voyage. We hope you will never look at a globe the same way again. Thanks for listening.
Keep questioning the map.